January Contreras is the Assistant Secretary for the Administration of Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Access to this page is restricted. What the fuck?
All right, everyone, warm up those brains. It's time once again for the Get More Smarter podcast. This one here is 228. I'm Jason Bain.
I'm Ian Silveri. This week on the Get More Smarter podcast, the brilliant business people and billionaires that are currently running the country are driving the economy off a cliff as Donald Trump's approval ratings slide into net negative territory at record speed. We ask, are we great again yet? Then, our neighbors to the north get rightfully pissed at American voters for putting this madman back in the Oval Office, this time with his North American imperial ambitions. We attempt to gently and politely remind them that more people voted for someone else than voted for Donald Trump. Sorry. Then, Denver's Mayor Mike Johnston goes to Washington, D.C., and it goes a lot better than it could have, unless you're a Republican ad maker. And finally, we check in with a few of Colorado's Republican members of Congress to see how they're handling this whole governing thing. Spoiler alert, not great. But first, Dr. Sarah Wilson Sokhey of the University of Colorado joins us to talk Ukraine, Russia, and whether we've ever seen a president of the United States or an entire political party parrot the propaganda of a foreign adversary. Take a listen. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Sarah Wilson Sokhey, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Colorado, the founding director of Studio Lab for undergrads, and a faculty associate at the Institute of Behavioral Science. She's also a member of PANARS Eurasia, a network of over 100 academic experts specializing in Eurasia. She was inducted into the University of Colorado's President's Teaching Scholars Program in February of 2024. Sarah writes about the connection between politics and economics with a focus on countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Her current work focuses on local democratic politics in Ukraine, which is why we've asked her to come on the show today. Her work has been published in too many journals to name, and she has written for popular press publications, including the former Monkey Cage blog at the Washington Post. She also hosts the excellent weekly Civil Society and Ukrainian Resistance Speaker Series webinar, which you can register for on her website at sarahwilsonsokhey.com. Dr. Sarah Wilson Sokhey, welcome to the Get More Smarter podcast.
Thank you for having me here.
So let's start with a basic question that President Trump has been, changing the answer to lately. Who started the war between Russia and Ukraine?
Russia.
Okay, how'd they do that?
They invaded Ukraine. They invaded the sovereign country. In 2014, actually. So the war really started in 2014, and then the full-scale invasion, which certainly escalated things, started in 2022. But Russia definitively started the war.
So we should believe our lying eyes that watched Russia invade, including...
Yeah, I saw it on TV.
Including this picture of apparently Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth standing in front of this TV saying, tracking Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when he was a Fox News host. So we should believe what we're seeing right here. This wasn't Tammy
That's
Duckworth photoshopping this, right?
That's right.
Okay, very good.
Can you give us then a brief overview of how we got to this point? Let's start with, why does Russia want Ukraine?
Russia wants Ukraine for power and control. There's mineral resources, as we know from negotiations with the Trump administration recently, that Ukraine has, oil pipelines that go through Ukraine. So power and money, the typical things that countries invade other countries for. And there's also a big ideological component that Putin really appears to be very genuinely committed to dominating Ukraine, and Putin, I think, by all accounts, genuinely believes that Ukraine should be part of Russia, that Ukrainians really are Russians, and that Russia should control the territory. So there's that ideological component too, but there's a lot of power and money reasons that Russia wants to control Ukraine.
Is capturing Ukraine, would you say, the end or the beginning for what Russia is looking for?
The beginning. If they're successful in dominating Ukraine, which I think is still very unlikely that Russia would completely dominate the country of Ukraine, they will keep going. They will absolutely 100%. Everything they have said and done suggests that they will keep going into other countries and other parts of Europe. At the very least, areas like Transnistria and Moldova, Abkhazia and North Ossetia, and Georgia, in the country of Georgia, they would be very likely to try to interfere in the politics of the Baltic states, even more so than they've already tried to do. So it's very much only the beginning. Lighted right now because the tide appears to be turning in their favor.
So this wouldn't be just about trying to take back old parts of the USSR. They're looking at expanding beyond that.
I would say that there's a good indication that yes, that they would want to expand beyond that, at least to the borders of the former USSR, and then to have a great deal of control and leverage over parts of Europe that they maybe don't territorially control. But I think it's extremely likely that if they had success in getting back former territories of the USSR, there's every indication that the Russian government would keep going.
What is your opinion on the timing of the Russian invasion in 2022? Do you think Russia moves faster if Trump is reelected in 2020? Or did they move faster because it was Biden? Or was it not related?
I'm not sure that the American presidential elections were the critical determinant of the timing. The timing is a really interesting question, and we don't have a good understanding of why Putin chose that precise moment to take those actions that he did. It's still, till now, we don't have a great knowledge of why February of 2022. So it's hard to say if it had to do something with the American presidential elections, but it certainly was that Putin is very ideologically committed to it and thought that through, and we know this now, through erroneous military and security information he was getting from his advisors, thought that Russia could take Ukraine in a couple of weeks. And 3 years later, with the full force of the Russian military for 3 years, and now turning to North Korean troops,
Right.
Russia has still not been able to take over Ukraine.
What role has the idea of NATO expansion, specifically Ukraine being able to join the organization, played in Russia's decision to invade?
From the Russian perspective, it was a motivating factor, but from any factual stance, the timing doesn't make sense with that. So when Russia launched the full-scale invasion in February 2022, there were no discussions of Ukraine being admitted into NATO. There were no serious negotiations happening. Nothing had changed recently on that front, and Ukraine likely would not have gotten into NATO at
Were
that
they
juncture.
trying? Was Ukraine trying?
They wanted to be in NATO, but I don't think that would have happened. I think that the sort of the security guarantees issues and what Ukraine would contribute, and frankly, the concern about a reaction from Russia would have meant that was extraordinarily unlikely before the full-scale invasion.
And this might sound like a pretty elementary question, but our podcast tends to focus on like Colorado politics, so our listeners are not like international relations experts. Can you just explain, like as briefly as possible, like what NATO is and does, why it was created, and why Ukraine wanted to join to begin with?
NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so it's a security organization that emerged in the post-World War II era, and it was created initially to counter the power of the Soviet Union. And so that's why Putin in particular has seen NATO as an anti-Russian force. It was created to balance power against the Soviet Union in the post-World War II era. And it is a security organization. And in the 1990s, NATO took stances in international conflicts, so like the former Yugoslavia, that the Russian government was not on the same side of. So the Russian government has long seen NATO as being not in agreement with its security agreements, and its security and foreign policy stances. There was a big debate in the 1990s about NATO expansion, and if NATO should let the Baltic countries in, like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and if that would provoke Russia and make the Russian government more aggressive and feel more threatened because it's a security organization and it's expanding right to Russia's borders. So the kernel of truth in a lot of misleading statements you'll hear about how, because this is not true, it is not true that the West caused this or the US caused it or Western governments caused it. The kernel of sort of truth there is these discussions in the 1990s and early 2000s about NATO expansion provoking Russian aggression. But NATO expanded to the Baltic countries, and we didn't start a war at that stage when it expanded to, and that happened in the late 1990s. And so, but there were a lot of discussions about that. And then there were discussions about, but really just discussions, no serious negotiations about possibly Ukraine joining NATO, but there was never a serious process by which that was happening. What provoked the 2014 territorial invasion was a discussion that the Ukrainian president at the time, at the last minute, backed out of a trade agreement with the European Union. So Ukraine wasn't getting into the European Union, but they were going to sign a trade agreement with the European Union. At the last minute, Yanukovych, who was the president at the time, backed out. There were mass protests Yanukovych tried to forcefully suppress those. He ends up having to flee the country because of the unrest and threats to what he saw as a threat to his safety. He goes to Russia. And then Russia invaded the Donbass region and illegally annexed Crimea. So this is a long-winded answer to your question about NATO.
It's a
but
good one.
NATO is a security organization that did expand when Russia became an independent country. There were discussions and debates and fears about if its expansion would threaten Russia. So what you'll hear some people argue is that didn't the West provoke this by expanding NATO? And that's really highly misleading. That's a very misleading way to put this. Especially look at the timing. Yeah.
This is like a very typical, especially like American GOP, but like right-wing canard, where you take like a tiny molecule of the truth and then blow it way out of proportion and then draw this like impossibly inaccurate conclusion out of it and say, isn't this your fault?
Right.
So that's where, like, we'll get into this Oval Office exchange in a second. This is almost a perfect transition into that. But before we do, why should our listeners who are mostly in Colorado and the United States and weirdly like in a bunch in India now, I guess, care about Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Like, how does this affect Americans? Like, I have friends who don't make that much contact with politics, especially international relations. So, like, we have, the sort of Canada, Mexico, ocean. Like, this isn't our problem. Our tax dollars aren't being well spent here. Why should we be giving billions of dollars to a country several oceans away where this really isn't our problem? What do you say to that?
Right. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a threat to the global security order and democracy around the world. And that sounds abstract maybe, but is true that Russia invading Ukraine caused and is causing a cascade of problems around the world that threaten global security and that threaten democracy around the world. And then this odd intersection, which for me is still odd, I don't know if I'll ever think it's not odd intersection of American and Russian politics is partially evidence of that. But the reality is that we're a global world now. None of us live in isolation, and Russia invading Ukraine is an attempt by an aggressive state to expand its powers, and it will keep going. On some level, I understand why, if people are not very sort of attuned to Ukraine, they don't know where it is, they haven't heard a lot about it, they don't know a lot about this conflict, and there's lots of conflicts around the world. That's true.
Sure.
Absolutely. I understand at some level why it's sort of like that's their battle over there, but really it's not. Really it's a global conflict, and really it's something that affects all of us and affects global security around the world, aside from the humanitarian reasons to care. So there are very good reasons it's in the U.S. best interest that even if we were, I don't like the phrase America first, but even if we were putting America first, we would care about Ukraine, and we should care about what happens there.
I want to follow up on something that you said, and maybe this is just a bizarre question, as you stated, essentially, but what is the intersection between American right-wing politics and the sort of pro-Russia? Like, where did this come from all of a sudden? There's this kind of, I feel like, hopefully silly accusation that Donald Trump is some kind of compromised Russian spy who had a code name, like, floating around the last couple of weeks. I don't know if that's true or not, but, like, what's your take on the why, if you can posit that?
And I don't know if that's true or not either. I've heard the same rumor and the speculation about could he be, and I don't know of evidence that that is true.
Right.
But the fact that there's speculation about it even is telling of where we've gotten in American politics, that there's this odd intersection. It's really an about face for conservatives. So we've gone from the Republican and conservative side being the ones that are very skeptical of the Russians and are very like, Russia is the enemy, don't engage. They have their own interests at heart, to being, no, we should be trusting the Russians and we should be doing business with them, and let's lift sanctions and let's have meetings and let's have negotiations, and it's our fault for demonizing them and leading to this situation like we somehow caused this conflict with Ukraine by doing that. So it's very much an about face on Russian politics, which is hard to like. It's a little bit. It's mind spinning. I think that about face. So maybe that partially answers your question. It's more of a reaffirmation that it's an odd world that we're living in. These are very much not normal times.
Well, and we're not going to ask you about the P tape. At least we won't go there.
Yeah, good Lord. So yeah, we try and like
so many. It is this like there's conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And some of them are theories that we don't know if there's evidence for them or not. And I want to be very careful about what we actually have evidence for or not. But the fact that we're even discussing that, I think, is telling.
We're going to transition into talking about that bizarre Oval Office meeting. But first, before we do, what should our listeners know leading up to this visit, like in the recent history that sort of outlines what happened here?
One important thing to know is that Zelensky had very pragmatically and diplomatically and really respectfully tried to maintain connections with the Trump campaign and then the Trump administration. Even before the election was held, Zelensky had met with Trump and he had announced to the Ukrainian public that he said a very Zelensky-esque kind of thing of, well, Trump says a lot of things, and I've never heard him say he doesn't support Ukraine. He was really trying to hold out these sort of, like, he says a lot of stuff, and I've never heard him say he'll pull aid. Now, that's proven to be not true, but he really seemed to be trying to create a world where there could be good Ukrainian connections with the Trump administration in a very pragmatic way of realizing that this could very likely be the next American presidential administration, and how would they handle that. And then since the start of this year, since the Trump administration has come into power, Zelensky had initially strongly rejected a mineral deal that was proposed by the United States Trump administration, and then had said they made some revisions to the terms and said that Ukraine would sign a minerals deal, and came to the White House presumably to sign a version of a minerals deal with the U.S. where the United States would get a large proportion of the revenue of the profit from Ukraine's rare earth minerals and resources that it has. What happened instead is what we saw on Friday, which I find personally embarrassing and painful to watch.
Yes.
Well, so let's watch it and get embarrassed together. Just a couple minutes of what I think is one of the more heated parts of this exchange, when it appears that there was a fire kindling and then J.D. Vance threw a gallon of gasoline on it. Here's part of that exchange.
He broke this ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to. I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly what
Remember
you're
this.
doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about
it. From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once? This entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
So yeah, my heart rate goes up when I watch that sort of thing, and I don't even know nearly as much as you.
Is there any doubt in your mind that this was a setup by the Trump administration?
I don't know The extent of to which it was a setup or not, it certainly comes across that way, that Zelensky didn't even need to be there. They were going to say what they needed to say and frame the issue the way they wanted to frame it. And so it certainly comes across that way.
When you watch this, then what do you think, in your mind, is the goal for the Trump administration? What are they trying to do?
I think that they're trying to erroneously reframe the situation as one that's Ukraine's problem and not a global problem. And that's really dangerous. And I think what we see here is just the beginning of the U.S. breaking decades-long alliances with Europe. And that the U.S. and that it's this very transactional kind of politics where there's no ideological basis for an alliance or for a commitment. It's really, what can you give me? What can I give you? And this will be continually renegotiated. So there's no commitment to Ukraine because there's no commitment to Europe. And if there is, maybe you'll give us some of your mineral wealth and then we'll make a guarantee, but this is going to be continually negotiated. There's no commitment based on ideology. And so I think their goal here is to reframe this as, look, we've helped you. You should be grateful, and then you should do whatever it is to get that help going forward, not we're working together to solve what is a global problem. Right? Because really the other way to frame this is the U.S. should be thanking Ukraine for fighting against Russia by itself for 3 years with no outside troops, with a tremendous amount of weapons support and aid support, for which Ukraine repeatedly, and Zelensky even immediately, during and after the meeting and before, has always expressed enormous gratitude and thanks for. The notion of saying to him, you haven't said thank you, it is mind-boggling. But we should be thanking them for having fought against Russia by themselves for 3 years, for having lost hundreds of thousands of people, for having 20,000 of their children kidnapped by Russia and taken to their country, and doing this while expressing gratitude and while trying to bridge connections with Europe and the United States, as opposed to belittling them and saying, well, what can you do for us now? You owe us back. You need to pay us back, when they've done this enormous service for Europe and peace and democracy in the world. But I think that J.D. Vance and Trump were really committed to reframing that into this terms of what it means for America to thrive is for us to squeeze every drop of resource out of other countries. That it's all about making a deal. It's not about diplomacy. It's not about ideology. It's not about principles. None of that. It's just squeezing whatever we can out of other countries.
So let's talk about this deal, this rare earth mineral proposal, which Zelensky was ostensibly there to sign and left without doing so as a result of this meeting largely. And we're talking about minerals like cobalt that are key to the electric vehicle transition, that are key to renewable energy technology. Can you just kind of explain the shape of what this deal was for our listeners and where it is now as a result of this meeting not having gone very well?
Right. Initially, the proposal was that the U.S. would get 50% of the mineral wealth, and then it was renegotiated on, I guess, somewhat better terms, although I don't know all the specifics of what they were going to get when, although it was going to be set up into an account where the U.S. would get profits off of the mineral wealth. And to be honest, because I don't know exactly when this will air, I'm not sure what the status now is of how they're negotiating it. The talk is, though, there was talk that maybe they would sign something right before Trump addressed the country the other night, but to my knowledge, I don't know the most recent version of this deal that might get signed. What's troubling about it is that the World Bank has estimated that it will take at least $500 billion to rebuild Ukraine after the war, to repair the damage.
And that's just so far.
That's just so far. And so insisting that Ukraine hand over half of its mineral wealth is, for me, a painful kind of concession, given the amount of resources they'll need to rebuild the country. The UK has stepped in and said we can use some of the frozen Russian assets and start transferring that to Ukraine. Those are estimated to be worth about $250 billion. So that's still only about half, even if tomorrow they got all of that money, which is not how that's going to work.
Right.
Even if that would only be half of what the World Bank has estimated will take to rebuild the country. And so really any deal that takes wealth away from Ukraine puts them in this situation of dependency, needing more aid in the future, the demographic challenges they're facing, given the deaths of the war and the people who understandably fled the country,
right,
are putting them in, setting them up to not do as well as they could.
sort of kind of looked like, from my uninformed perspective, like a shakedown for U.S. tech interests or industrial interests. Was this a conversation that was happening with the previous administration led by President Biden, or is this like this mineral deal for arms or for peace or security or whatever, an invention of the Trump administration? And is there something to this idea that it was what it looked like?
To my knowledge, the Biden administration did not have discussions about a mineral deal like this, to my knowledge. And the Biden administration was generally inclined to focus more on the economic potential of Ukraine and investment of the country and building back the economy, because there's lots of mutually beneficial ways for the country of Ukraine to develop and have investment. And it had that before the war started, to be clear. It already had a lot of tech investment too, and people in the country who were very tech savvy, like almost like a Silicon Valley transplant over to Ukraine that I think people aren't aware of before this started. To my knowledge, this is new to the Trump administration.
If the U.S. continues with this idea of suspending military aid to Ukraine, can they fight off Russia without it?
It's going to be harder. The European allies, Germany and the UK and France especially, and others, not just those countries, have really rallied to support Ukraine in this moment. Zelensky left that meeting, flew straight to London, and had a polar opposite reception in the UK.
Yeah, with Keir Starmer, like kind of a stodgy old guy, but showed up in this moment, right?
Right. And so the UK said, we will put boots on the ground and planes overhead to ensure a ceasefire agreement. That's not committing troops to fight, that's committing troops for peacekeeping purposes, but it's hard to overstate what a big deal that is. That the British stepped up with a huge aid package, committing to actually send troops for security guarantees. So one version of this that people talked about is, well, maybe something could be negotiated that the Trump administration and Russia would agree to, and Europe would provide the security for it. But the fact that we're talking about that grouping of something that Russia and the Trump administration would agree to, that Europe would then provide the security for, right, tells us where the alliance lines are, so that it's Trump and Russia against Europe. And that goes back to this transactional kind of politics where they see Europe, Russia and the Trump administration maybe see Europe as something to carve up or to have leverage over, or to that, and that's not the world we've been in before. And I think we're just starting to begin to see the implications of that.
What role does misinformation or disinformation play in shaping American or European, or I guess general public perception of Ukraine's leadership and the conflict?
Misinformation plays an enormous role in perceptions of the conflict on both sides. And what's so troubling for me, for someone that has been going to Russia since 2002, the last time I was there was 2019, just before the pandemic. And so I spent a lot of time in Russia. I mean, I've lived in Moscow. I had an affiliation with a Russian university, long time focusing on Russia and Russian politics. And what's so troubling to me is to see Kremlin propaganda just be parroted back at the American public and accepted. And to see it parroted by an American president and administration is enormously troubling and scary. So misinformation is a huge part of this.
Can you just give us one or two examples of that propaganda that you're hearing coming out of the American president's mouth or Republican politicians, just for our listeners?
The most blatant is that Russia isn't the primary aggressor in the war, that Russia didn't start the war. So saying things to Zelensky like, you should have never gotten into this war, I think Zelensky agrees. Like, Russia should have never invaded Ukraine, right? I mean, that's the most blatant. Or that Zelensky's a dictator, which is utter nonsense. He was elected in a free and fair election in 2019 by a very large margin. His approval ratings, as many people have now pointed out, are not 4%. They're over 50%, 57%.
Better than Trump's.
Better than by a lot.
Yeah.
And so that's another. But the Zelensky's a dictator was how Putin has justified invading the full-scale invasion in 2022. Is that, well, they're being led by neo-Nazis, also fictitious.
Right.
The kernel of truth, again, because you talked about this earlier in your question, the kernel of truth that, like, there is a far right in Ukraine, but it's much weaker than countries like Germany, frankly. Which is also what's scary, and in other European countries.
And countries like Germany, where Elon Musk and J.D. Vance are propping up the AfD, which is the neo-Nazi adjacent party, correct?
Right. which didn't do as well as it could have in the elections
Thank
just a few
goodness.
weeks ago.
Yeah.
But it did well, and it's still a big player, and it's still very much a concern that the AfD is doing so. So this is all to say, like, these are Russian talking points that have Trump appears to just repeat, and that's shocking. That is appalling and shocking to just hear an American president repeat what is blatant authoritarian propaganda.
So since you brought up these two exact questions, Elaine Godfrey with The Atlantic went ahead and asked every Republican member of Congress in the House and the Senate these two questions. Did Russia invade Ukraine, and is Vladimir Putin a dictator? And the answers will shock you, mostly because there weren't very many of them. I think she said about 25 responses. There was a Colorado connection here, Representative Jeff Hurd, who we affectionately refer to as a bread sandwich because he's a pretty boring guy. But he did actually answer the question in the way that we would have. Did Russia invade Ukraine? Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an unprovoked act of war. Russian President Vladimir Putin is a dictator. Vladimir is undisputably an enemy of America and a dictator. It is dishonorable and wrong not to stand up against the tyranny of Putin, said a spokesperson. So that's accurate to your understanding, right? That's what
Yes.
you think Representative Hurd is correct there. Good. So do we.
Yes.
Why do so many Republicans have a hard time saying this very obvious and demonstrable truth?
There appears to be a very strong impulse to show loyalty to the Trump administration, which is also troubling because we see Republicans that previously were vocal supporters of Ukraine becoming...
Lindsey Graham comes to mind.
Lindsey Graham just falling right into line with following a Russian propaganda narrative. And I really don't know, if I'm being honest, I don't know an alternative way to put it. I've rarely been in a position as an academic where statements that I would consider basic statements of fact have become politically controversial because we're in such a politically polarized time. But I cannot honestly say, with the 20 years of traveling to Russia and studying, writing about Russia and teaching about Russia, I can't honestly say that I see another interpretation that's accurate. Putin is a dictator. Russia's not a democratic country right now, and they have a long history of using propaganda and media control, and that very sadly has infiltrated American public opinion now.
It seems to me as absurd as saying Russia is actually very tropical and warm and nice this time of year. Like that's
It's like looking out the window and arguing about if it's raining or not, right?
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
you can report, I've heard that people give this example before, like you can report that some people say it's raining and some people say it's not, but you could also look out the window and see if it's raining and like report on, is it actually raining or not? Like you can report on the debate that people are having, like that they're saying these two different things, but you can also provide like which one of these has a basis in fact. And we seem to have lost that in the U.S.
Is there an historical precedence that you're aware of for American politicians doing this?
Doing what?
Just parroting the propaganda of another country for whatever reason? Just like all of a sudden this switch? Have we seen this before?
I'm not sure we've seen it quite like this. So maybe it's a bit of a yes and no, but I think mostly no, we haven't seen it. We've certainly seen American presidents be swayed by other leaders or point out that or make an argument for why other countries have a point or a certain side of a conflict, something like that. So there's maybe sort of some parallels there. I don't think we've ever seen, to my knowledge, an American president back a dictator this publicly and back their ideological statements. There's been criticism of the U.S. government before in backing dictators and that doing trade deals with them or looking the other way or things like that. There have been people who've criticized the U.S. government for that. I don't think that we've ever seen, though, a U.S. president adopt the ideological, authoritarian kind of propaganda stance of an authoritarian leader in this way.
One of the arguments that's coming out of the Trump administration, specifically from Vice President Vance, is that economic agreements might offer stronger security guarantees than military alliances. And that's sort of a stated goal of theirs, to shift the sort of like weapons donation or sales to Ukraine in favor of the sort of like economic commingling of interest. Do you think there's any reason to think that might be true?
So that the Trump administration is motivated by economic interests with Russia?
Sure, or the
idea
mineral deal.
That they would work better than just a military alliance. Vice President Vance seems to be saying that economic agreements would go further in protecting Ukraine than military alliances. Does that make sense to you?
Not in the way that they're proposing it. Economic alliances can be really powerful and can be mutually beneficial, and they can help ensure peace. In the context of the war in Ukraine, it's difficult to see how any of that matters if Russia doesn't leave the country. If Russia doesn't stop attacking Ukraine and leave immediately, it doesn't seem how any economic alliance can really provide that kind of security. I think in a larger sense, and this may not be exactly what you're asking, but in a larger sense, the Trump administration, going back to this very transactional idea of politics, does have the sense that they could do economic deals with Russia that would make them a lot of money personally and maybe for the U.S. government, and that they could do deals with Ukraine and that they can maybe play all sides to get the best economic deal. But proposing that Ukraine turn over part of its mineral wealth without adequate security guarantees of any kind, it's difficult to see how that is a real solution. And that's what Zelensky said. And the important difference to see is there's a difference between Zelensky wants peace, but he doesn't want surrender. And there's a difference between those two things. And this is what Zelensky stood firm on. So I think Zelensky did a remarkable job in responding to what was an awful situation and an awful way to treat any foreign leader visiting, but especially one who's at war for the existence and survival of their country. That Zelensky stood firm on we're not going to pretend that Russia didn't start the war. And we can't end this without a guarantee that Russia stops attacking. And won't attack again.
So this has been an amazingly enlightening conversation. We're extremely grateful for your time and your expertise, so thank you for coming on the show. Before we let you go, what else do our listeners need to know about the state of things in the region, and do you have any guess on what happens next?
It's a really precarious and hard moment for Ukraine, because ideally they would be negotiating peace with full-throated American support. And so the thing to know is that this is really a very, very critical turning point in the war at which Ukraine can very much still win and have a free and independent country in which Russia's not attacking, especially with the support of Europe and ideally with the support of the U.S. government. That is still very much possible. It's very unlikely that Russia can take over the country and simply capture it because it's been trying with the full force of its military for 3 years. So one possibility is that people continue to needlessly die, that the fighting just continues because Russia has been given an incentive to keep fighting. The Trump administration is pretending that they've given Russia an incentive to come to the table. But what many observers have pointed out is that the Trump administration has given Russia an incentive to keep fighting for even more territory.
Right.
And so one possibility here is that people just keep dying, and Russia is emboldened to do any number of dangerous things in the region. And Putin likes to periodically remind people, casually and seriously sometimes, that Russia has nuclear weapons. But there are very good reasons that we should want to contain Russia right now and not embolden it to take aggressive actions in Ukraine and in other countries, because it will keep doing that. So there's some very good analysis and commentary by Michael McFaul. I don't know if you know, he's a former ambassador to Russia.
Oh, yeah, I've seen his tweets. He's involved in the conversation.
He's very active on social media and writes a lot of op-eds and very good analysis about this is not how you do deals with Putin. This is not how Putin is very savvy and clever and also very evil, and really has particular goals in mind. And we should be aware of that. So I think that's the thing that I would leave people with, is that this is a precarious moment, and it's one in which things can kind of go either way, but one very tragic, awful, sad reality is that it could just be people dying unnecessarily in this conflict for far too long. I mean, it's already been far too long and could continue.
If our listeners want to learn more, we, of course, would direct them to sarahwilsonsokhey.com, Sokhey. You mentioned just a minute ago one of the other sources you keep an eye on. Where else should people go if they want to follow what's happening and get accurate information about it?
Two very good news sources that I like are the BBC and The Guardian. And I like to recommend those to an American. I know you might not just have an American audience, but an American audience, because we are in such politically polarized times that it's hard to suggest news sources to people not news sources that are credible. I mean, there are very much credible news sources, but ones that people don't trust.
Right.
Because we're so politically polarized. And the BBC and The Guardian have very good, accurate, real-time reporting on what's happening in Ukraine. And they're not stuck in the American politically polarized environment. So it's a good place, a good outside source in a way for U.S. citizens to be able to reference, to know what's going on a day-to-day basis. I'll make a plug for much more than my website, which is whatever. I would go to ponarseurasia.org and I give you the link. But that is this network of academics who are providing analysis and background that's more in depth about what's going on in the region. So people from the region, which I think is really critical to note. So it's not just Westerners commenting on this, but lots of Ukrainian scholars and scholars from different countries of Central and Eastern Europe commenting on and providing analysis on what's going on, who have really in-depth knowledge of it. So I think ponarseurasia.org, the BBC, and The Guardian, and honestly, Kyiv Independent provides really good coverage as well, and Euromaidan Press. The speaker series I lead, we had the editor-in-chief on, Alia Chandra, was on talking about Euromaidan Press, provides English language, reliable news about Ukraine. They're a really very good source, and Kyiv Independent. So all of those are good places to check out. And thank you for having me on today, because it's so enormously important that people care about Ukraine and are paying attention to what's going on.
Final question.
Thank you for joining us.
Do you have social media? Can people follow you? Are you on X or Blue Sky?
They can. I'm not very good at social media, but I do have it.
Okay.
I'm on Blue Sky now, and Blue Sky is the main one that I use. I'm on Facebook
Us too.
as well.
We
because I'm
refuse.
old. Old people use Facebook still, right? So
Totally.
But Blue Sky, I'm on now. I'm not the best at social media. I try, but yeah.
That's what we're here for. But hey, Dr. Sarah Wilson Sokhey from the University of Colorado, thank you so much for coming on the Get More Smarter podcast and sharing your expertise with us and our audience. We really appreciate your time. Safe travels, and we hope to talk to you again really soon.
Thank you.
Sometimes I write these things out, and I kind of can't fucking believe that it's not just like invented out of whole cloth.
Oh, yeah. It's like, oh, yeah, that did happen. Huh. Yeah, we're there. Oh, hey, look at that.
Well, before we get started with the rest of the show today, after that awesome interview with Dr. Sokhey, we have an email that we wanted to read to you all.
Yeah, we're getting
from
a fan. We're getting a ton of new emails and reviews and comments, and keep them coming.
Yeah, quick reminder, email angryrants@getmoresmarter.com, Ian@getmoresmarter.com, or Jason@getmoresmarter.com. This intrepid listener sent it to all of those addresses, which means we definitely saw it. Email goes, "Hi, Jason and Ian. Love your podcast. I listen every week while I walk the dogs. I was happily astonished to hear early in January that you were rated as one of the top podcasts in the world. We were equally astonished, and happily so. Several sources have reported that DOGE and the GSA, that's the General Services Administration, are planning to terminate leases and sell federal office buildings across the country. The Federal Center in Jefferson County is the largest concentration of such buildings outside Washington, D.C. I've heard. That's what we've heard, too. Sure enough, the Wired article about it, parentheses, and they've done some of the best reporting on the antics of DOGE and,
true.
Quite frankly, of all of this administration. They are doing the job of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, everybody else way better than they are. Has a map that shows many of the buildings there. I'm not sure which one has the School of Mines nuclear research reactor, but that one had better stay in the right hands. Yikes.
We have that?
I guess so. I think the state of Colorado and Jefferson County should be the first in line to purchase these and lease them back to the federal government, or at least ensure they're under proper, responsible management. We don't need a rerun of the Soviet Union's fire sale of state assets to the oligarchs, although some are doubtless salivating over that. Keep public assets in public hands." And we'll put a link in the show notes to the School of Mines research reactor in the Federal Center, which is nuclear.mines.edu/facilities. Perhaps Ian can put a bug in Rep. Pedersen's ear. Yes, already done. And thanks for your email. This podcast technically represents the Federal Center, even though nobody there voted for us to do that.
We're not far from there, either of us.
No, we're just a couple blocks away, and we're equally concerned about this. It looks a lot like what Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs did to the entire Russian public asset system, like you say, after
and even
the
if it's
1999.
not that bad with the oligarch side, if they did close the Federal Center, as we've talked about, there are a lot of small businesses, restaurants, and hotels, bigger businesses around that area that are all going to die.
To say nothing of the fact that this is a huge part of Lakewood and Jefferson County and therefore Colorado's overall economic engine, including what you just said. But there's several thousand, I think over 6,000 federal employees that work at the Federal Center right now. And the way things are going, it looks like finally, and we'll talk about this a little bit in Trump time, that the Musk-Trump bromance is starting to hit the skids a little bit. He had a cabinet meeting earlier this week where he basically told Elon to fuck off a little bit and for department heads to actually run their own departments. And Elon is there to make recommendations and can't just fire people. There's all sorts of memes running around that say, you're fired. Oh, wait, you're rehired. Oh, wait, you're fired again. We can't find your email address. Can you please bring the nuclear secrets back to your old office? We think that maybe this first tranche of firings taught them a valuable lesson in slowing the fuck down a little bit on some of this stuff. And maybe they will think twice or be a little more
question
careful.
Mark is not good.
Right. No, well, I mean, have you seen these emails?
Yeah.
It's like due to performance reasons. It's like, fucking no, that's not it.
That's not why.
And then Trump, of course, got himself in some trouble when he, in his joint address to Congress, said that Elon Musk is in front of Doge, but in court filings they're saying, what? No, he's not. It's somebody else.
He's just a guy, yeah.
It's going great.
All right, well, let's get started with Trump time. As always, our goal here is to help you break through the flood the zone policy to focus on the things that are most important. We won't get into the Ukraine news because we covered that extensively in our interview this week, so we'll jump ahead to a couple of topics. You may be aware that there was a joint address to Congress this week, set a record for the longest meandering joint speech, including State of the Unions, in history.
About 2 hours, yeah?
Yeah, other than that, there's nothing important
I mean, I tuned out after an hour and a half, and I could not fucking believe that he was still going after that. But, you know, this is a guy who exists to hear himself talk, so we shouldn't be that surprised.
Yeah, and it was a campaign rally speech again, just not a guy who's a president speech.
Felt like the most cynical part of it, and there were a lot of cynical parts of it, was when they like celebrated this like brave young person who had survived brain cancer while at the same time slashing billions of dollars in research for childhood cancer funding.
Right.
And of course, if you point this out, they just throw tomatoes at you and say, boo, you hate kids with cancer. But it's like, no, you hate kids with cancer.
Right.
You're using this one as a prop.
Well, the big problem that Trump has got again this week is Trumpflation. He campaigned on lowering inflation.
It's not just Trumpflation. It's like Trump economy. It's like Trump terrible. The markets, everything is a disaster. Even the crypto pump and dump is a lot more dump than pump at this point.
Yeah, we do need a broader term, but for now we'll stick with Trumpflation. The economy
Soon it'll be Trump session. Hate to say it.
Yeah. Trump campaigned on lowering inflation and the price of groceries. Instead, the economy is going off a cliff, and the White House is just sort of shrugging.
When they're not blaming Joe Biden.
Right. This Washington Post headline is just baffling to me.
I can't because I canceled my fucking subscription to the Washington Post when
shit.
Jeff Bezos bent the knee.
All right, let me try it. There we go. White House mum on price relief measures as inflation stings Trump's ratings. It says, and the subhead reads, "The president knows his plans," a White House official said, while Trump presses ahead with tariffs that economists warn will push prices higher.
Don't listen to economists. Can't listen to those guys. Eggheads.
No.
Liberals. Academics. What do those guys know?
Stupid numbers.
Oops.
The Washington Post story says that on his first day in office, Trump signed an emergency executive order directing agencies to take steps to reduce the cost of living and requiring his top economic advisor to report back on the progress within 30 days.
Oh, how's the report look?
44 days later, the White House said there is no formal report, just conversations between Trump and National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett. Quote, "The president knows his plans," unquote, a White House official said, speaking on the condition of anonymity because the official wasn't authorized to discuss the matter publicly.
When you have to go on background to say the president knows his plans, like everything's going great.
The official declined to provide details and referred further questions to various federal agencies. There's no plan.
No, the plan is chaos. It has always been chaos. Last time he inherited a very solid economy from Barack Obama and then cut taxes and then the market went up, which is the thing that happens on the short term every fucking time. Mm-hmm. This time he inherited a much better economy than Joe Biden inherited for sure. Trump wrecked the economy during COVID. Biden resuscitated it and brought it back to life and put it on to interest rate cuts on the horizon for the Fed, more money in people's pockets, the lowest wage gap between the races in American history, all these really good economic indicators. Were we out of the woods yet? Of course not. But like, we had a global pandemic that wrecked the entire world, and we had the strongest, fastest recovery of any country in the world as a result of Biden's policies. Now Donald Trump has inherited that and said, what if I did a bunch of shit that everyone is telling me is going to wreck this economy? And guess what happened?
Here are the numbers, and they're all bad. Recently, the worst February job loss data since 2009. The first time
the banking crisis. That was in the middle of like an actual objective economic dynamite situation.
This was the first time in 32 years that job losses have been this bad outside of a recession.
Yep.
Consumer spending down 0.9% in January. Consumer prices up 3% in January, so those two things make sense. Inflation accelerated in January, remains well above the Federal Reserve's 2% annualized target. Energy costs are up 1%, which doesn't seem like a big deal until you remember that we've had 5 months of year-over-year declines.
And these are supposed to be the guys that make energy cheaper by drilling baby drill.
Right. Eggs are spiking to a record $4.95 per dozen.
I'm so fucking mad about this. Like, I'm a baker. Eggs are pretty important to the whole hobby, and like, it's just so shitty.
Yeah. You have to use I can't believe it's not eggs or whatever that.
I've tried. Those things are fucking disgusting.
You could rent a chicken or something.
My neighbor, my neighbor. I was changing Sam. Brittany was out with Davis, and I get a knock on the door that was like kind of fast. Look through the little camera, and it's our neighbor across the street, young girl and her friends, and they're all panicked. And I open the door and I said, what's going on? Come in. They said one of our chickens is dead in the yard, and the rest of them are missing. I go, oh my God. So I chatted with their dad. You know what happened?
Huh.
My theory was like theft because eggs are so expensive. No, hawk attack.
Ooh, that's not good.
It was brutal. Poor butter. R.I.P. Butterscotch. Yeah.
R.I.P. Butterscotch. We'll never forget. A couple more numbers. Recent economic trends have sparked fears that the U.S. could be headed for a rare bout of stagflation, which happens when the economy and the job market slow at the same time inflation rises. This hasn't happened since the late 1970s, early 80s. And according to a recent Reuters Ipsos poll, 51% of Americans now disapprove of Trump's handling of inflation, 47% disapprove of his overall handling of the economy, and 2/3 of Americans say the country was on the wrong track when it came to their personal cost of living.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
How many times do you have to learn this fucking lesson?
Apparently at least twice.
It's just like Republicans destroy the economy. Democrats win the next election. Bring it back to life. Put it back on the right track. Guess it's time to give Republicans back control to destroy the fucking economy again. And here we are, like clockwork. This time it's happening in record time, which is interesting.
Really fast.
44 days.
Trump is already backpedaling like crazy on his tariffs. He's suspended some of them with Mexico and Canada after the stock market tanked when he implemented the new tariffs on March 1st. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had an absolutely perfect response to this tariff twisting.
It's a psychodrama. Your Foreign Affairs Minister yesterday called all of this a psychodrama. How do you characterize it?
Thursday.
It's perfect. This is a pattern from Trump's first administration. He'd do something dumb about the economy like tariffs. People would freak out, and then he'd pull out his eraser and be like, just kidding.
There's like the sinister conspiracy side of me that's like, yeah, but like the people who know he's going to wreck it, like, all buy low, and then like they know he's gonna like reverse all the tariffs, and then the market goes back up, so they just like keep making money on this like fucking hamster wheel while everybody else gets stuck holding the bag for it.
Yeah, that's not implausible.
Sucks.
And as we discussed last week, the majority of Americans do understand now that tariffs are indeed a tax on American consumers. So
would have been nice for them to understand it in fucking November.
Yes, that would have been helpful. And let's talk a little bit about Canada.
A little bit more about Canada, which is looking better and better every day.
Well, until it becomes America, maybe. Trump apparently is actually serious about trying to take over Canada. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apparently thinks so. According to the New York Times, Trudeau says, quote, what he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy because that'll make it easier to annex us, unquote. Trump apparently claims the 1908 treaty that set the boundary between the U.S. and Canada is invalid. Why he would know this, I don't know. There's been no explanation. That's a weird thing to drop out of nowhere. Like, by the way, when we drew that map in 1908, no, not good. That was wrong.
Of course, like, the obvious rejoinder is, oh, but the Mexican-American border, totally fine. You get to build a wall on that. No problem there, right?
Yeah, or the other rejoinder is, where's Canada? Point to it.
He keeps calling him Governor Trudeau. I hate this shit so much.
Here's more on what's happening from Jimmy Kimmel.
Stock market by announcing he's delaying some of the tariffs he put on Mexico and Canada earlier this week. But Canada's in full-on defense mode right now. In response to the tariffs, many Canadian stores American-made liquor off their shelves. That's all liquor from the United States. It's all gone. And this is a painstaking process for Canadians because they apologize to each bottle as they remove it from the shelf. I'm so sorry. Can you believe we're shaking down Canada? They must be so confused. We had such a good relationship. It's like, you know what it's like? It's like we suddenly got hooked on meth and we went to the apartment upstairs and yelled, "Do you got any money?"
not far off.
Oh, God.
I'm having real trouble understanding how or why this would work. In a news conference on January 7th, which I missed apparently, this was before Trump was inaugurated, he responded to a question by a New York Times reporter about whether he was planning to use military force to annex Canada and said he planned to use economic force.
This is not outside of the bounds of the conversation we just had with Dr. Sokhey about Russia and the U.S. and Ukraine, military versus economic force. But you shouldn't be using force on a sovereign nation, your neighbors, on the same continent.
Can you imagine if another country said out loud that they were trying to take over the U.S. through economic force?
Like Mexico or like Cuba?
We'd be on a war footing.
I guess.
If that happened.
And like Trudeau is, I think, doing a good job kind of handling this like as it comes. But like at some point, like I don't know what the fuck to do with a guy like this. It's so bad.
Apparently, Trump cabinet people and advisors are telling Canada that Trump thinks a lot of treaties and agreements that have been signed over the years with Canada can just be abandoned.
Including his own USMCA trade agreement, which he's violating every time he threatens or puts a tariff on our neighbors to the north. Yeah,
this seems, again, like not a thing. I don't remember in the election people being like, we want Canada. What candidate will deliver Canada to the United States? I don't remember anybody asking for that.
Yeah, I guess not.
Let's talk about our own Denver mayor.
Wait, there's one more little tidbit here. They're trying to eject Canada out of this intelligence sharing group known as the Five Eyes with Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. Then they would just be Four Eyes, just kind of like calling them a nerd.
Yeah, it's not as cool.
Mean.
we got to leave him in just for the better.
Five Eyes is
name.
Way more badass. Four Eyes is kind of like what I get called by people who have uncreative insults.
You really get that still? Four Eyes? Yeah.
No.
I would
Never
just
really
stare
did.
at someone who said that. Like, really? Four Eyes?
Well, I'd stare at them because I can't really see them that well.
Oh, that too. Mayor Mike Johnston, Denver's newish mayor, went to Washington this week to testify in front of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform alongside
It's like the House
mayors.
Committee on Bad Faith and Content Creation is like really what it is. Like it is not there to do any kind of oversight on anything. Obviously, if they were, they'd be like stopping Elon Musk and Donald Trump from dismantling the federal government.
Right. He was there alongside mayors from New York City, Chicago, and Boston. The point of this was to give Republicans a chance to create some sort of viral moment about sanctuary city policies. Johnston did a good job not taking any of the Republican bait and sticking to his script. Here's part of his opening statement, which I thought was pretty good.
I now recognize Denver Mayor Johnston for his opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to testify today. This committee convened this hearing on the critical topic of immigration. I want to tell you Denver's story. When I became mayor 20 months ago, Denver was already receiving buses of immigrants with little to no notice or coordination. At
Thanks,
one point,
Texas.
we were 10 to 11 buses a day. dropping off as many as 300 people, mostly women and children, in 10-degree weather with only sandals and a T-shirt, leaving them in danger of freezing to death on our streets. All told, 42,000 people arrived in Denver over 18 months, the largest per capita influx of any city in America. We are each entitled to our own opinion about what should happen at the border, but that was not the question facing Denver. The question Denver faced was, what will you do with a mom and 2 kids dropped on the streets of our city with no warm clothes, no food, and no place to stay? As mayor, I have to protect the health and safety of everyone in our city. As a man of faith, I have a moral obligation to care for those in need. As Scripture says, for I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. So that's what we did. In Denver, we believe our problems are solvable, and we are the ones to solve them. So we went to work. When we started, we had the largest encampment in Denver history, with more than 200 migrant families living in freezing temperatures. So we opened 8 different city shelters housing 5,000 people. City employees volunteered to take extra shifts, and Denver residents stepped up, making meals, donating clothes, furniture, school supplies. Some even welcomed families into their own homes. We helped 8,700 eligible individuals apply for work authorization so they could put food on their own table, pay their own rent, and reduce the strain on public resources. As a result, a year later, there is not a single migrant encampment left in the city. We have closed all of our shelters. We have connected people to jobs and housing, and the city's immigrant support budget has dropped by nearly 90%. And in the midst of this, migrants did not bring a wave of crime to Denver. In fact, crime went down. Homicides dropped 17%, shooting victims dropped 24%, auto theft down 29%. America is not just a place.
I got to be honest, I did not think this was a very good idea.
I didn't either.
When I heard that he was going voluntarily and not going to put up a fight or get subpoenaed or anything like that, I was like, okay, well, looks like our fair mayor is going to star in some Republican midterm TV ads. I was wrong. He did a fucking great job.
He did, and the Republicans didn't do much either. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert of Colorado is on the committee, so she got to ask questions right away. She didn't do much, nothing memorable. Kyle Clark of 9 News later interviewed her in her office, and her answers were largely nonsensical and contradictory. Listen to this clip.
And before we get there, here's Donald Trump Jr. hawking gold.
It's that devastating event to strike without warning.
What the fuck?
Lauren Boebert, thank you for the time.
Yes, welcome to Washington, D.C. I want our local county commissioners to be in charge of their county. They oversee everything that takes place in their counties, and they do a really fantastic job until higher governments get involved and tie their hands. So certainly if Denver wants to remain a city that has these ordinances and follow in line with Colorado state sanctuary policies, well, then let them do that. And then the citizens can choose if they want to reelect that same council. And then if places like El Paso or Douglas County or Elbert County, anywhere else, if they want to have stricter enforcement and coordinate with federal law enforcement officers, then they would have the ability to do so.
So Boebert's saying she's all for local control, but that's not what any of this is about.
No.
This is about national
It's
control.
the same bullshit. It's local control on the issues I want, federal control or state control on the issues that I want. Heads I win, tails you lose. That's all this is.
Right. Republican leadership also tagged in Colorado's other Republican members of Congress so they could try to do a thing. Jeff Bread Sandwich Hurd left the room before speaking.
I got to tell you, the bread sandwich, man.
He might be out, yeah. I get the feeling
right.
he's not into the bullshit theatrics. He kind of...
No, and neither is his district. His district kicked Boebert out. She was going to lose. She almost did in a district that Donald Trump won by double digits twice. Hurd's not a dummy.
No.
He knows if he's just normie Republican, he gets to have his job as long as he wants to. If he tries to throw in with these freaks, not going to work.
Jeff Crank in the 5th Congressional District and Gabe Evans in the 8th Congressional District did take their shots. Gabe Evans mostly rattled off a bunch of inaccurate talking points. We'll get to that in our next segment about Gabe.
Don't you love that so in this tweet, I guess I'll show this real quick. Gabe tweeted this. Quote, migrants did not bring a wave of crime to Denver. In fact, crime went down, Mike Johnston. This is categorically false. Then he CC's Tren de Aragua. They're like, oh, my alerts went off. What the fuck?
Right.
I've been CC'd by Gabe Evans.
Who oversees the Tren de Aragua X account?
And then, of course, Chase Woodruff from Colorado Newsline. Johnston's claim is unambiguously true. Large numbers of migrants began arriving in Denver in the winter of 22-23. Comprehensive Colorado Bureau of Investigative Data shows overall crime rates are down in the city since then. Homicides and auto thefts have seen the steepest declines. Take a look at this little table down here. Violent crime,
That's
down.
from the city of Denver.
It's property crime, down. Other crime, down. Total, down.
Down, down, down.
If you look at 2022, which is when this migrant influx started, to 2024, down across the board.
Yep. Hasn't been a great week for our 8th favorite member of Congress from Colorado. He has got some... Evans, as we mentioned, tried to throw some stats at Mike Johnston, and then when Johnston tried to push back, Evans just stopped him. Take a listen to this.
Chair recognizes Mr. Evans from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking member, for allowing me to wave onto this committee. And, of course, thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to come and have this conversation. So, Denver Mayor Johnston.
And by conversation, I mean get yelled at.
Grew up in and around the Denver metro area, also Latino, grandson of immigrant from Mexico. And I also served for 12 years in the U.S. Army, Colorado Army National Guard, and in the Denver metro area for another 10 years as a police officer. And unfortunately, as a Denver metro area police officer, I've seen firsthand how public safety in Colorado and in Denver is plummeting. When I started my law enforcement career,
Police officer in Arvada, by the way.
Nation for our crime rate. We were ranked 3rd in the nation last year. Denver, 6 years ago in 2019, they didn't even make the top 50 most dangerous cities in the country list. This year in 2024-2025, U.S. News and World Report ranks Denver as the 10th most dangerous city in the country. Denver has twice the homicide rate as San Francisco. We've lost more than 7,000 Coloradans to illegal drug overdose deaths since 2020, with a significant percentage of that coming from illegal drugs like fentanyl. And we know from criminal intelligence that in the Denver, Colorado area, almost all of that fentanyl is being trafficked by illegal transnational criminal organizations, the Jalisco cartel and the Sinaloa cartel. We've seen a massive increase. This is just a recent headline. We've seen an increase in Tusi, which is the drug of choice of Tren de Aragua in the Denver metro area. And we've seen headlines that show that overdose deaths in the Denver metro area remain stubbornly flat despite falling in pretty much everywhere around the country. In terms of violent crimes, Denver's had over 6,400 violent crimes. So that's including things like 689 sexual assaults, over 1,200 robberies, over 4,400 aggravated assaults. And again, depending on which database you look at, anywhere from 65 to 71 homicides. Again, double the homicide rate of San Francisco. So the first question to you is, for those homicides, do you know how many of those were committed by people illegally present in the country?
Thank you, Congressman, and happy to answer that because I think you may have some bad facts. I'm happy to clarify that. In terms of what's happening in Denver right now, as we know, crime is down in Denver from last year to this year.
Reclaiming my time, Meyer. Do you know? Reclaiming my time. Do you know how many of those 65 to 71 homicides were committed by people illegally present in the country? And I'm happy to show all of the sources for my facts.
We don't ask anyone's status at point of arrest. We do not know someone's status when they're charged.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer, Mr. Mayor. And I'm glad you've brought that up because as you can see displayed here, we actually have a planning bulletin.
This kills me.
Giant laminated,
year, which pretty much says what you just said.
Photocopied memo with a
Denver
huge highlighter.
Is prohibited.
Yeah. What is with that? Why is it laminated? There's this for our audio only listeners, there's this humongous.
It's the size of Gabe Evans, and it's a memo. It says training bulletin, and it's a full page of text with yellow highlighter. It is
nobody can read it, even though it's humongous.
They were like,
and why is it
the
laminated?
instruction from Johnson's office was, or from Speaker Johnson's office was like, make some visual aids to harass your witnesses with, and they're like, I know. I'll blow up an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper to the size of a human being. Highlight some shit in yellow. Call it good.
And laminate it.
I can't tell if like the photocopy of the thing was laminated or if they laminated the giant reproduction of it afterwards.
I don't maybe, or if they put it like in a big like Ziploc bag, or
it's also like
what's happening.
Jeff Hurd got the fuck out of there as quickly as possible because he has survival instincts. Gabe Evans is just carrying water for a very unpopular administration and soon to be even more unpopular policies. This right here is not the show he thought it was going to be for him.
No, and he has other things to be worried about, particularly Medicaid. Evans was appointed to the House Energy and Commerce Committee in January. This is the committee responsible for healthcare policy, which means Evans is going to have to take votes on Medicaid cuts, even if the Republican budget bill never makes it to the House floor.
Yeah, I don't know if we showed this last time, but our friends at Center for American Progress have a great tool on their website that lets you look at Medicaid enrollees by congressional district. Did we show this?
I think we've shown one. There's one from Georgetown University also.
Here's a new one. By district, so to get one, Evans, number 8, down here for our viewing audience, you can see that CHIP Plus program is in effect in his district. The number of constituents covered by Medicaid or CHIP Plus is 163,000. The district funding loss will be $2 billion, and the reduction in Medicaid or CHIP enrollment on this terrible budget will be 43,000 people will lose their health care. And CHIP is for kids, by the way. Yep. Child Health Insurance Plan is what CHIP stands for.
There is no wiggle room here, as the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office reaffirmed this week. The Republican budget must cut Medicaid or Medicare in order to achieve its budget goals. There's no other way.
Even if you doged the shit out of the rest of the federal government and fired 90% of the people, you could not get $880 billion. The nonpartisan, they don't work for Democrats, they don't work for Republicans, they work for Congress. Congressional Budget Office says so.
And there's even more bad news on the Medicaid cut proposals from Gallup. In their recent survey, they asked, do you think it is the responsibility of the federal government to make sure all Americans have health care coverage, or is that not the responsibility of the federal government? 62% of Americans say, yes, it is the responsibility of the federal government. Which is like
going up, like around the sort of Obamacare fight. You can see this graph right here. That trend was in the opposite direction, peaking at 56% saying no in 2014, only 42% saying yes. But since 2014, the last 10 years, that has improved 20 points to 62% saying yes, it's the government's responsibility, and only 36% saying it's not.
So you're going to make big cuts to a thing that everyone likes, and you're going to get reelected? Good luck with that.
There were a lot of voters in Gabe Ish's district who voted for him and Trump because they thought that they could control costs and make life less expensive. Not because they thought they were going to kick them off their fucking health care and make everything more expensive with ridiculous tariff and trade wars and bad policies. This dude is a one-termer.
100%. And might be followed by Colorado Springs Congressman Jeff Crank, who apparently is a real boy.
And I think we can safely say he's our 6th or 7th favorite member of Congress from Colorado at this point.
Yeah, he's not good at congressing. We were joking in our last episode about whether the freshman from Colorado Springs was indeed a real person because we hadn't really seen or heard from him. And turns out when he starts talking, he doesn't do well.
Which is kind of incredible because his previous career, of course, was talk radio host.
Right. Crank tried his hand at yelling at Denver Mayor Mike Johnston. He got nowhere. We're not going to bother with that. He's going along with whatever Trump wants, which is going to bite him in the ass. He made a number of dumb comments recently in a virtual town hall meeting that basically just affirmed everything Trump wants. The Trump administration is trying to make massive cuts to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Yeah, it's nice. The Trump administration is trying to make massive cuts to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Crank represents the most military-heavy district in Colorado. Fort Carson, the Army base is down there, the Air Force Academy. that's not going to make a lot of people happy down there.
Nope. Entire economy dependent on the military-industrial complex down there. You cut 9%, 10%, 15%, 20% of it, it's going to have real effects. It's the same conversation we had with the Federal Center earlier.
Crank is also trying to deny that Medicaid cuts are coming and saying that it's fear-mongering from Democrats. Perhaps he doesn't really understand all of this, but here he is on Forbes Newsroom undercutting his own argument.
And here's the bottom line. To the people who want to fuss and want to say, well, we shouldn't cut Medicaid or we shouldn't cut here or there. Well, where should we cut? Because we're almost $36 trillion in debt now. And I would just say if people who can, it's easy to say, well, you can't cut there and you can't cut there. But that doesn't change the fact that we have to cut somewhere. And so we have to figure out how to make government smaller because the federal government has been too big for too many years.
Just stuck your foot in your mouth on that one.
Well, we got to do it somewhere. We got to make these arbitrary. Like, this could literally be solved.
You don't have to cut it somewhere. You don't. No one's forcing it.
They're choosing to. And, of course, Donald Trump added a third to a quarter, depending on what numbers you use, of the actual debt that we have right now. Interest on that debt continued accruing close to 10% or higher during Biden's administration. So, yes, President Biden spent money, but he spent it on domestic priorities like the Chips and Sciences Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, things that Republicans voted for, too, by the way, especially on the bipartisan infrastructure law. This was not like Democrats overspent and now Republicans have to be the responsible governing party. They are going fucking apeshit on this. And a smart, responsible governing party would reach across the aisle and say, okay, listen, we have a math problem. We're not charging rich people enough in taxes, and maybe we're spending too much money. Is there a possibility for a compromised budget where we will raise taxes on billionaires and soon-to-be trillionaires and the wealthiest corporations, and we make some cuts too? Are you guys up for that conversation? I think a lot of Democrats would say yes, but instead, they're only handling one side of the ledger, and it's not just that they're only looking at making cuts. They're looking at making more tax cuts at the same time. They want to raise the debt ceiling trillions of dollars so they can continue to accrue debt while eviscerating services for real people all over the country. This is not going to end well, actually, and it's certainly not going to end well politically for guys like Hurd, Crank, or Evans.
Crank also said in his town hall meeting that he backs proposals to eliminate the Department of Education, which he also doesn't understand. He says, quote, "You don't want your congressman deciding on what kind of book should be in a library or what the curriculum should be," unquote. I agree, which is why it doesn't happen now.
That's good. Can you imagine what a pain in the ass that would be if like Brittany had to like go through like the reading list of every school in her district?
States and local governments set education policies. They always have.
Mm-hmm.
The Department of Education doesn't do that.
No, they set guidelines. They give grants. They do student loans. That kind of thing.
Read up a little, Jeff Crank.
Yeah.
Inform yourself. Let's talk about some 2026 election news and rumors. There's been some stories about Senator Michael Bennet maybe wanting to run for governor. People close to Bennet are floating this idea to the Colorado Sun, which I think would significantly change how the 2026 election plays out here.
Well, sure. I mean, the only announced candidate right now on the Democratic side is Attorney General Phil Weiser, and I've disclosed that I'm working with him on this campaign. I'm very excited about him. I think he'd be a great governor. And Senator Bennet, suddenly, who is not up for re-election again until 2028, says, hey, maybe I get a shot at the old governor's job, which I think is really unfortunate.
Yeah.
On the one hand, he has no risk because if he loses the primary, he stays in the Senate. He doesn't have to resign to run. That's not a rule.
Although
since he's not
he
up
might
in
want
the
to
cycle.
consider it.
Well, he might want to, but he doesn't have to.
Right.
And then the other question is, does this prevent people like friend of the pod Joe Neguse or Ken Salazar or Jenna Griswold, who were widely rumored to either be mulling a race or actually planning one, from getting in the campaign? And does this mean it's a one-on-one between AG Weiser and Senator Bennet?
Yeah, it'd be tough because I think because of Bennett's long-standing connections and time in the Senate, he's going to raise a ton of money for a campaign like this. It would be kind of poetic if he became governor and then governor, or if he won the race for governor and then Governor Jared Polis appointed someone else to finish his term in the Senate, because that's how Bennett got there to begin with.
Right.
Governor Bill Ritter in 2009 appointed him when Ken Salazar left to become Secretary of the Interior. That, by the way, was one of the all-time biggest shocks still in my political life. I still remember the Colorado Polls headline, "What the hell?" That was the only thing we put.
Is that what you wrote?
Yeah. It wasn't because Bennett wasn't qualified, but at the time he was the superintendent of schools in Denver, and I don't think anybody would have guessed that he was going to be the guy Ritter would pick. There were a lot of other names like House Speaker Andrew Romanoff at the time.
Who ended up running an unsuccessful primary in that.
Right.
That was the 2010. So Bennett was appointed in 2009, but then he had to run for re-election in that seat in 2010.
Right.
The challenge from Speaker Romanoff came and went, and Bennett won that pretty handily, and then had a very, very, very close election against then, I think, DA of Greeley, Ken Buck.
Yeah.
Who he defeated by 1 vote per precinct statewide.
Yeah, and Buck might have won had he not tripped over his own Johnston on that.
With that high heels comment?
High heels comment late in the campaign, right?
Pretty sexist stuff against one of his primary opponents, Jay Norton.
So what would Phil Weiser do? Would he keep running against Bennett? I
haven't talked to the AG about this, but he's raised over $1 million at this point, and for all intents and purposes, he is running for governor.
It'd be a tough decision, though.
Sure. I mean, maybe not. I think Phil is termed out of his AG's race. I think he has a great argument for why he'd want to be governor, and I'd be really surprised if he decided to not continue running, because it's not that he's running against anyone in particular. It's he's running to be governor of Colorado because he thinks he'd be the best guy to do the best job.
Sure,
I agree.
but politics does intervene, and
Sure.
you would have to consider it. As for Joe Neguse, would he be the most likely person for Polis to appoint to the Senate if Bennett won?
I mean,
maybe. I don't
Joe's
know.
a great guy. We love him here on the podcast. He would be a historic first black person to represent Colorado in the U.S. Senate. He'd be very young, obviously, getting in that office, which means he'd have a lot of runway ahead of him. I think he'd be a great U.S. Senator for sure. But I guess that's up to Governor Polis.
Yeah. And then Secretary of State Jenna Griswold, rumors are swirling that she's looking harder at running for Attorney General instead of governor. I think that probably makes more sense for her. I think governors, as you and I have talked about for a lot of reasons, particularly her kind of troubled past as Secretary of State, I think governor would have been a much harder lift.
Sure, but then she runs into a race where there are 2 announced candidates already. Former House Speaker Crisanta Duran and current Boulder County and surrounding county District Attorney Mike Doherty.
Who will be on the show next week, by the way.
Yeah. Soon to be friend of the pod.
And there's still no word about any serious Republican candidates for any of the 4 statewide constitutional offices or the U.S. Senate.
Nor will there be, because no matter who you are, if you're a Republican, I guess the asterisk on that is John Elway, but I still think that actually won't work anymore.
I don't think Elway would
totally.
work, yeah.
No, it's too smart.
Smart enough not after he destroyed the Broncos when he was president.
Let him do to the state what he did to his football team.
Right.
And finally this week, before we get to our quick hits, article that tickled me personally from our friends at the Colorado Sun, the unaffiliated. This is their newsletter. It says, headline, how slashing Colorado's income tax rate would increase economic disparities. That's right, because we have a flat income tax, and that means that if you cut it, it disproportionately helps the wealthiest and disproportionately does shit for people who aren't that wealthy. Further slashing Colorado's income tax rate or eliminating it altogether would, quote, increase disparities in economic outcomes, according to an analysis by the legislature's nonpartisan staff. Think of this as the CBO for the state capitol. Families making more than $200,000 a year, about 8% of the state's taxpayers, would stand to save an average of $608 if the rate were to drop to 4.25% from 4.4%, and $17,844 if the state's income tax was eliminated completely. Meanwhile, families in the lowest income bracket, earning up to $15,000 annually and representing 12% of the state's taxpayers, would save an average of $5 under the rate reduction and $154 if the income tax were eliminated. What more proof do you need that flat income taxes are regressive?
And the income tax is the biggest single contributor to the general fund, so you'd have a whole other problem on your hands in terms of funding government services.
The article continues and says, income tax revenue makes up the largest share of the general fund, like you said, generating an estimated $12.4 billion in the current budget year. Go back and listen to our episode with Jeff Bridges. See how much of the overall budget that is. The answer is almost all of it.
Conservative activist Michael Fields is working on 2 different ballot measures to cut the income tax.
Hey, he's got to make an argument to keep getting paid, so why not?
Yeah.
Because
yeah,
if he
not a good
cuts
idea.
taxes for his wealthy benefactors, they would save that larger amount of money that would then trickle on down into his little bucket there. What a nice deal for him.
Indeed. All right, let's do a couple of quick hits and we'll roll out of here this week. We start with our FAFO, our fuck around and find out of the week. This one is from a YouTube channel called Trend Feed, and it's farmers who voted for Trump.
Very much finding out.
You voted for President Trump. So now, in this moment, you say you're in a free fall. What is your message to him?
So I'm off the Trump train. Where I'm going for now is I got to protect my business.
Highland, a wheat farmer who says he's lost $400,000 since Trump took office.
I think there was a lot of people who voted for him that want to stay loyal to him, but it's going to get to the point where financially, if it's between supporting the president or losing your family farm.
At this point, some Trump...
Fucked around, found out.
I think we said this last time during the segment, but it's like the whole notion of like, I thought he was going to hurt all the people I hate, not me.
Right.
What a shitty way to be. Like, I'm sorry that you're experiencing the leopards eating your face.
Right.
But we all told you what was going to happen.
Right. This wasn't a mystery. Tina Peters, the former Mesa County clerk and recorder who's in the clink at the moment for several years because of her shenanigans years ago trying to steal data from her own election computers to prove some sort of 2020 election fraud.
You might need to go back and listen to our series of interviews with then Grand Junction Sentinel reporter Charles Ashby, who followed the saga up close and personal and kept kind of reporting back to us on it over the years. It was a wild journey.
The Department of Justice is now involved. They're reviewing the case. And I'm going to say this very explicitly because this is important. They're reviewing a case of a former Republican clerk and recorder who was prosecuted by a Republican district attorney with testimony from Republican county commissioners.
And in all likelihood, with a majority of Republican jurors because it's fucking Grand Junction and they are a very Republican city in a very Republican county.
I don't know anywhere else. There aren't many places you could have gotten more of a fair shot as a Republican.
No.
This is a slam dunk case.
She kicked a cop. She stole the identity of one Gerald Wood. She broke into her own office to steal data from her own machines to try and prove the big lie, and then smuggled it across state lines to give it to the cyber ninjas and the MyPillow guy. Man, I hate it here.
Yep. There's also a Colorado Public Radio story today talking about how some local politicians are getting emails about this. My favorite line here, quote, Democratic Rep. Jenny Wilford of Northglenn said she's received about 50 emails so far this week from Peter's supporters, mostly people from Texas, unquote. To recap then, a Democrat from Northglenn is getting a bunch of emails from Texas about a Republican in Grand Junction. Got it?
Who's seeking a pardon from, or they can't pardon her because it's state crimes that she committed, but seeking some kind of commutation of sentence from the governor, who he's not going to do that.
I don't think so. And the governor's office says she has not applied for that anyway. So dumb. Will the pettiness ever end in the Trump administration? Maybe not. The Small Business Administration apparently is going to move its offices out of Denver. They're moving out of a bunch of big cities because they're mad at Democrats for so-called sanctuary city policies. I don't know who this actually hurts other than small business owners.
Oh, do you want to know who this hurts the worst out of everybody?
Yeah.
Dave Williams. This was going to be his gig. He was going to be the regional SBA director because that's where you park people like him and Greg Lopez. And
well, unless they move to Colorado Springs, be closer to his house. But
maybe.
The reason they put these offices in big cities like Denver, New York City, Chicago is because, spoiler alert, that's where the people are.
You want to hurt the economy? Do this kind of thing.
And this doesn't mean jack for Denver. Nobody in Denver gets hurt by this. It's stupid. Speaking of Republican idiocy, friend of the pod, Christy Powell, best friend of the pod, Christy Powell, says that House Republicans are filibustering a bill to prevent price gouging in times of emergency and to protect consumers. Apparently because they're worried that there might be bad lawsuits. This is why you're in the minority, morons.
Not a mini minority, or not a micro minority, but a mini minority.
This is why you have no power. You absolute morons. Well, good, measles is coming. As the New York Times reports, an unvaccinated person who died in New Mexico tested positive for measles. Possibly the second fatality in a growing outbreak that began in West Texas, which means could be moving this direction.
I hate it here. I have a 1-month-old baby who can't get a measles vaccine until he's 1 year old. And
the last time
Mike Johnston keeps making his mom fly to fucking Washington, D.C., which is like a disease vector of the entire goddamn country.
The last time someone died of measles in this country was 10 years ago.
Of course.
This didn't need to happen.
What's Health and Human Services Director Robert F. Kennedy Jr. doing about it?
He says you can take cod liver oil.
That's what I give my dog to prevent him from shedding.
So you won't shed and you won't get measles, I guess, or I don't know.
You're definitely going to get measles.
Do you pour it on yourself?
You might not shed.
Oh, my God. This is so ridiculous.
Going great.
All right. Finally, our gibberish of the week. House Speaker Mike Johnston was on Fox News explaining how the Founding Fathers were hoping that one day an unelected bureaucrat billionaire would destroy the federal government.
That's going to be a great innovation. I think it's going to change the way government works. I was with Elon Musk in his office across this parking lot from the White House about a week ago. Late at night, we're meeting, and I said, we're both getting increasingly excited about all the savings that he's finding. And I said, we're looking at this differently. You think of it as a data analyst and a scientist. I'm looking at this as a constitutional law attorney and a historian. Elon, it's not just about saving money. This is revolutionary. We're going to restore the founders' original vision for the Constitution. They wanted a limited federal government that had careful oversight by Congress, but Congress hasn't been able to do that because they've been hiding the data. He's found it. It's going to change the way we do government.
So the Founding Fathers wanted a limited federal government overseen by Congress. That's not what's happening.
No, they wanted it limited by the richest man on earth. That's what they're saying. It's... You know that part in Hamilton where the richest man on earth comes to limit the federal government and writes that into the Constitution?
The fuck? Enough.
I hate it here.
Stop it.
We have 40, what is it? 6 more months of this? 45
Yeah, we've got a lot. But we do, good news, have an angry rant. The first one we've ever gotten.
That's right.
I'm really excited about this.
This is from a listener called Brandon, sent during President Trump's joint address to Congress. Brandon writes, how the hell are you going to judge your kid for using they, them pronouns when your name is literally a month of the year? Sit down, January. P.S. If everyone is just fine the way God made you, does that mean Republicans are fine with gay people now? If so, do you think the state party was watching tonight? All right.
Good rant.
If you have an angry rant, go ahead and send that over to angryrants@getmoresmarter.com and we will read it on the air.
Absolutely. That does it for us this week.
The Get More Smarter podcast is a production of ColoradoPolls.com and the Bighorn Company. Your hosts are me, Ian Silverian, America's dad,
Jason Bain,
who managed to figure out how to engineer and produce this thing. I normally make the video, but Jason and Megan are doing that for now because I'm still kind of sort of on leave, but I've been doing a lot of podcasting. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Jason. Breakmaster Cylinder made the theme song. Get your shots while you still can. It's getting worse.
And your castor cod
liver oil. Your omega-3s. Rate the show and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts.
Rub some dirt on it. The measles will go away.
Oh, God. I don't recommend that. We're not liable or responsible for any healthcare advice given on the show.
Yeah.
If you leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, a comment on Spotify, or a reply or a tag on a post on Blue Sky, or just email or text us, we will read it on the air. Usually, subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Rate the show and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts if you got more smarter, because it helps us a lot. Find us at getmoresmarter.com, where I will eventually start writing again. Promise, but give me a couple more weeks. And please send all angry and non-angry rants to angryrants@getmoresmarter.com. Other shit to Ian at getmoresmarter.com, and other shit to Jason at getmoresmarter.com. Thank you, Dr. Sarah Wilson Sokhey, for being our guest this week. And thank you so much for listening. See you next time, as long as it is still legal to podcast.